Cuba is now under a total blockade. No fuel for planes, no petrol, no electricity for homes, and the streets are completely empty of cars. So now Trump is putting the world in front of two choices: either to choke Cuba, to participate in choking Cuba, or to face sanctions from America. But the question is, why doesn't China intervene to save this country, Cuba? Why doesn't Russia intervene either? Has Cuba also been offered as a scapegoat, just like Maduro was before? We have some very important details for you today, but after this break, stay with us. Dear viewers, peace be upon you and God's mercy and blessings. Welcome to our program today in this renewed episode, God willing, of the Opinion series. Our topic today will be about this country, Cuba. It's clear that it has now entered the countdown phase. After we previously talked about the crisis in Venezuela and the crisis in Iran, today we are dedicating this episode to the crisis in Cuba, because the situation in Cuba has started to get out of control. The signs of collapse have started to appear, and soon all eyes will turn to this country. This country, which has been under a severe blockade from America, is now without oil and without electricity. More than a month has passed, and no oil supplies have reached Cuba's ports. The local oil reserves have started to run out. The country has entered a very serious crisis, to the point that the Cuban government has reduced public transportation, so that it can economize on the remaining amount of oil it has today. Also, thousands of workers have been laid off as an austerity measure, so that this remaining oil can last as long as possible. As a number of international newspapers point out today, these Cuban cities have become almost empty of cars. Meanwhile, power outages also continue to affect residents for most hours of the day, with some areas experiencing up to 18 hours of electricity cuts every day. Tourism in this country as well, and everyone knows what tourism is like in Cuba and how it forms the main pillar of the Cuban economy. This sector is suffering a lot today from these frequent power outages. This has made many major hotels, the famous hotels in Cuba, move tourists to other accommodations in places that are perhaps less affected or elsewhere. Thousands of tourists have left the country. As a result of this crisis, and even more than that, the crisis is now affecting the aviation sector as well. There is a major fuel crisis for jet fuel. Many airlines have stopped flights to Cuba. The Cuban authorities have sent notices or notifications to most of these companies, informing the airlines that jet fuel is not available at their airports. And this is for a period of 1 month, and of course it can be extended. All of this is happening today for two reasons. The first reason is the severe blockade imposed by America, as Trump is threatening all the countries of the world. Any country that supplies Cuba with fuel will have high tariffs imposed on it by America. So today all countries are afraid of these sanctions. They can't send any shipment of oil or any kind of trade shipment to Cuba. The last oil shipment that arrived in Cuba was on January 9th, and it was from Mexico. The second reason that also led to the worsening of this crisis in Cuba is Venezuela's submission to Trump's demands. Since the abduction of Venezuelan President Maduro, no Venezuelan oil supplies have been sent to Cuba, and Venezuela was recently the main oil supplier to Cuba. This is exactly Trump's plan, which is achieving great successes today. Trump wants to subjugate Cuba just as Venezuela is starting to submit today. In order to subjugate Cuba, they will make it live in complete darkness. Everything will stop in Cuba. Life will come to a halt on this island, Cuba. Because of the power outage just a few days or weeks. And this suspicious scenario will happen because estimates say that Cuba's oil reserves will only last for 2 months. Now, a month has passed and only 1 month remains, but Cuba is now implementing major austerity measures so that the electricity doesn't go out completely during this remaining month. They want to buy some time until the supplies arrive. This country has 11 stations that generate electricity using oil. 30% of this oil comes from local oil fields, but 70% comes from Venezuela and Mexico. So Trump is now a savior. He succeeded in stopping these oil supplies from Venezuela after arresting Maduro, and he managed to stop the rest of the supplies from Mexico after threatening them with high tariffs. So this blockade that Trump is imposing on Cuba is hitting the energy sector, the tourism sector in the country, and even the health sector. It is affecting vital sectors that Cuba strongly depends on economically today. If we talk about health, Cuba is known for medicine, known for the quality of its healthcare system. Cuba, it has more than 24,000 doctors working in more than 56 countries, in addition to tens of thousands of nurses and healthcare professionals, and so on. All these doctors and medical professionals are sent by Cuba to these countries as medical missions, paid for by these countries. And Cuba makes significant profits from them because it takes more than half of their salaries in these countries. Therefore, according to official data, they say that Cuba earns billions of dollars from this operation. They mention a figure reaching about $10 or $11 billion. So when Trump returned to the White House, he threatened a group of countries that America would stop granting visas to the citizens of those countries unless these countries expel these Cuban medical professionals, meaning Trump, in order to deprive the Cuban government of this money, told these countries to expel the Cuban health professionals, or else he would impose sanctions on them. Now this disaster is no longer limited to money and funding and so on, but it has reached the point of losing lives, because now, as a result, without electricity, without fuel, the health sector in Cuba will collapse, hospitals will stop functioning, and this time Trump is responsible. All the insistence on subjugating Cuba will not be through military force, as some might think, because Cuba is not Venezuela. Cuba is perhaps much more like Vietnam. So this time, subjugation will be through a comprehensive blockade. And this time the situation is different from what it was in the past, during the previous decades, because this blockade imposed on Cuba has been in place for about 60 or 65 years now. But it wasn't like this. It wasn't with this insistence, with this level of threat. In the past, there was significant Soviet support, there was strong support from neighboring countries, Latin American countries like Venezuela, Mexico, and some other Latin American countries. There was also Chinese support that appeared recently. But now, suddenly, Cuba has become alone. No one in the world can break this blockade. So now, in reality, Cuba is left with two paths it doesn't want. Either to submit to America, as Venezuela does today in one way or another, or to wait for the only savior. And who is this only savior? Russia. Despite the distance between Russia and Cuba, and despite the sanctions imposed on Russia as well, yet Russia is the only country in the world capable of saving Cuba from this historical predicament. Thanks to the fact that, first, it is an oil-producing country, and thanks to its possession of what is now called the Shadow Fleet, and its military power that also enables it to break this blockade, there has been an illegal blockade that violates United Nations laws for almost 3 months now. The United Nations issued a resolution supported by 165 countries, a resolution calling on America to lift these sanctions on Cuba. But of course, there is no law above America, and there is no one who can enforce this decision by force. In general, Russia remains the only power capable of breaking this blockade and saving Cuba from this crisis. But how can that happen? The Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Ryabkov, made a statement saying that Russia supports Cuba. He said that Russia is now providing material aid to Cuba, and that there are shipments of oil on the way to Cuba as humanitarian assistance. He also said that China is providing support as well, and that the situation might even be brought up to the Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa group, so that every Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa member can offer assistance to Cuba. But this is what's strange, and at the same time there was another statement, a different statement from the Russian presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, in which he said that Russia does not want to escalate against America. This means that Russia won't be able to do anything for Cuba except offer it some forms of support, which of course will remain limited to scraps, just scraps, and it won't get Cuba out of this crisis. And what's strange today is that if we look at the world map for countries that are considered Russia's strategic allies, we'll find that they are very few, you can count them on your fingers, and Cuba is one of them. And despite that, there aren't any strong steps from Russia to save this country, to save one of its most important allies. We saw how Maduro was removed and how Venezuela is now subject to Trump's orders in one way or another. If the same thing happens with Cuba, Russia's reputation will be at rock bottom. No country after that will be able to rely on the Russians at all, because the whole world will know that Russia is still weak, still unable to protect its own influence, and as a result, other countries will choose America and lean toward America. Even Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, countries like Brazil and South Africa for example, their turn is coming and they will be forced into the cage of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa plans. Therefore, Russia is now facing a crucial decision, a real challenge. Either it chooses confrontation and escalation by breaking the blockade of Cuba, or it loses this country and its reputation on the global level. That's why today there are demands coming from within Russia. Political experts are also calling on Russia to intervene. They say that statements and expressing concern are useless. What have we gained from statements and expressions? And so on. They say that there must be direct intervention on the ground to break this siege. And today, some of them are suggesting that every cargo ship heading to Cuba should be accompanied by a military vessel so that it won't be seized by the Americans. Some of them also say that Russia should not forget that this country, Cuba, has rare natural resources that Russia needs today, like nickel and cobalt. They say Russia should not lose such a country. Today, we are mainly talking about Russia because the situation is urgent and intervention must be swift. If there was time, we would be talking about China. We could say that China should also intervene, and that at the very least, it could provide some support. Solar panels for this country, which has good solar radiation, mean that solar energy projects are successful in this country. But despite that, in reality, what applies to Russia also applies to China. Why do I say this? Because China can also intervene urgently. It can save Cuba in a suspicious way. In fact, it could end this whole crisis in just 1 week at most. How is that possible? By sending one of its floating nuclear power plants, China has recently entered this field and now owns floating nuclear power plants. That means ships that generate electricity using nuclear power, so they could send one of them to Cuba and restore electricity to the country. So pay close attention. If there really was an agreement for intervention between just two countries, between China and Russia, they could save Cuba today. China with electricity and electrical products and so on, and Russia with oil. But the problem, as I said, is that they refuse confrontation, they refuse escalation, and so with this refusal, Cuba will have no choice but to give in and meet all the demands requested. And this is an important step toward achieving the principle of confronting Monroe. the western half of the globe will truly become American. So the question for you, dear viewers, remains: do you think Russia will risk a military confrontation to break the blockade and send oil? And is it the same with China, or will the pragmatism of these countries' interests make them sacrifice Cuba? Just like what happened with Venezuela? Let us know your answers in the comments. Peace, mercy and blessings of Allah be upon you. See you next time.